Hey everyone, and thanks for tuning in. If you're watching this video, it means that the PBR Painter 2.3 beta version is now available for download. So if you've purchased the add-on previously, you will now have access to this beta version to try out for yourself. This version's gone through a lot of alpha and beta testing privately, so it's a very well-established version, but as with any beta, there may be bugs, so I definitely encourage you, if you want to have a play around with it, do so on a separate independent file. Don't use any of your production files because you don't want to kind of mess anything up with the bugs that may exist in this version. This version, even though it's only a minor version, is actually a huge step up from the previous version. So there is a brand new UI, brand new features all over the place. Because of that, there's actually a lot of things to cover, and I'm definitely not going to cover everything in this video. When the final version is released, there will be a bunch of tutorial videos that explain exactly how to use all of the new features. But the point of this video is to provide a brief overview for those of you who have used the add-on previously and want to play around with the beta version, just so you can kind of get familiar with things, and then you can kind of explore and experiment on your own to figure things out for yourself. Finally, I'm going to be speaking quite fast in this video because there's just so much to get through. So again, the assumption is you're a user of PBR Painter and you want to kind of play around with the beta version. If you're kind of brand new to the add-on, I definitely encourage you to watch some of my other videos first so that you kind of understand the basics of the add-on, because otherwise the video might not make a lot of sense for you. Alright, so let's get started. So the first thing I'm going to do before I go into these new features is I'm just going to go through the setup process very quickly. So once you have the new version and you've installed it and you've restarted Blender, you'll see the preferences like this. So the first thing you want to do if you're using Blender 3 is you want to set up a directory where you're going to save all of your PBR Painter assets, because you can save all your materials with the Blender 3 asset browser, and that lets you reuse them over and over again. So you can do that with this box in here. Next thing you want to do is you want to click Load PBR Painter Workspace, and when you do that, it will load this UI in here. And it will automatically be set up like this. Final thing that's new in here is you now have an option to ask when you compile the shader. So what that means is basically when you're making changes to your layers, you won't have to wait for the shader compilation times every single time you make a change. You'll be able to manually click a button whenever you want to update the shader. So that's going to really improve the workflow and make things a lot faster. And the other thing in here, you'll notice it says hide the UI in other workspaces. So basically that means that you'll only see this UI in these sections in here when you're in the PBR Painter workspace. So that really helps declutter other workspaces, but you can turn that off if you want to. All right, so as you can see, it's a brand new UI and it's now an independent workspace. In the previous versions, it was just kind of one little panel in the texture paint mode, but now it's kind of got all these different windows and panels that are set up for this version. And I'll basically explain kind of what's going on as we go. One thing that I'll point out is with Blender 3, if you're using Blender 3, you will have the asset browser down here. And once you've set up that asset directory in the preferences, you will have the assets down here, and you can basically save and reuse any materials that you make in the add-on, which is going to let you basically reuse everything over and over again, which is obviously very, very convenient. And with Blender's asset browser system, that's basically just a simple drag and drop. So something like that. And now we have this material added to our model. And we have all of the settings from PBR Painter preloaded attached to that material. So very, very handy, obviously, to have this system set up. All right, so I'm just going to get rid of this one for now. So another thing I'll point out with this version is obviously the way that it's set up now, it's no longer constrained to the texture paint mode. So previously it was all texture painting, and as soon as you exited out of texture paint mode, you didn't have the add-on basically. But now it kind of goes back and forth between texture paint and the object mode or edit mode, depending on what you're doing, as we'll see. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and add a new layer with the new system, and sorry, that's a new material for a start. I'm going to click Set Up Material for PBR Painter. These options I think are the same as the previous version, and just click OK. Now this UI is mostly the same, but it will look a little bit different. So in this little box in here we have the background, so we can set up whatever we want for the background. We have the layers down here, which is all as per the previous version. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and make a new layer before I talk about anything else. So just clicking Add Layer. What you'll see now is you now have full layer type Previously there was multi-channel layers and single channel layers were the main two. Now we have standard layers, which are just basically the multi-channel layers, and the way that the new structure works, there is no need for a single channel layer. So they've become obsolete. So the standard layer is what you're going to use kind of 95% of the time, and I'll go through a couple of the other options in a second. The other thing that's changed, which is fairly significant, is previously, as I said, it was only in texture paint mode, which meant that by default, every single layer required some sort of painting. But now you have the option to choose between a filled layer, which is no painting, or you can choose the painted mode. So when you choose painted, this is exactly the same as the previous version. So you will use filled when you obviously don't need to do any texture painting. So really handy to have that in there. But if you want to do painted like this, you can just select that, select your resolution, and then click OK. Okay, so now that I've added a layer, you will see now that, again, there are some differences in the UI. So first of all, there are now the main channels that you're likely to use all the time up here, and the settings for that channel will appear in here. So you can swap between channels and you can adjust them very quickly, and it's much, much easier than previously where everything was a drop-down menu and you had to kind of go back and forth between the different settings to access anything. So this is much easier to use, obviously, because now you can kind of switch between the ones that you want and adjust as you need. So if I just swap back to material preview mode, I can just paint directly now. And we can see that we can then just adjust as needed. And that's on, the reason it's doing that is because it's on low. So there we go. So now it's just painting on this metallic glossy material over the top. So that's all pretty much the same as it was previously, but the UI is obviously very different. Another thing that's changed, if you go to normal channel and you turn the normals on, and by the way, this refresh material button is what I was talking about earlier. So this basically lets you decide when you want to compile the shader. So you can change a bunch of different channels, and then at the very end, you can click refresh material and it will apply all of your changes at the end. So you don't have to wait around for every single change to update. So the other thing that's changed with the normal channel is the bumping. So previously there was a slider for the bumping, but now you just turn it on and off. So if we turn it on, as we can see, it's now bumped the layer out. So we can turn it on and off, and it just does that instantaneously. There is automatically a color ramp associated with the bumping, so you can decide exactly how you want to set that up. So for example, you can get some really cool effects if you add in a bunch of different colors like this. You can kind of get it to bump up and down. Oops. So really kind of cool to have that in there by default. Like that. So you can see it's now bumping up and down at the edges of that, which can kind of give you some nice effects. And the cool thing is this is obviously non-destructive, so you can modify that as you need. So that now comes with the bumping by default. And obviously you can change the bump strength as you need. Alright, so another thing that is different, if you open up the layer masks tab, so the layer masks is now no longer in here, it's now in this separate spot over here to give you easy access. The painted layer mask is basically the mask that's associated with every single painted layer. So this is kind of, in the previous versions, this was always there, but it was sort of hidden behind the scenes, whereas now you have direct access to that. And you can do stuff with that if you need to. For example, changing the interpolation if you want to, and other things. Alright, so I'm going to add another layer and just go to a standard filled layer just to show the difference. So we go OK. And again, it says refresh material because it has to update, and I can decide when I want to do that. But if I say add color and whatever roughness, maybe put it up high, then I click refresh material. It's basically just applied that to the whole thing. So it's a filled layer, which means no painting, it automatically fills everything. Now I can now adjust the layer opacity, and that kind of adjusts the entire layer's opacity as opposed to just the opacity for the channels, which is really cool. Which is again different in this version. The other cool thing with this version, as I said, it goes back and forth between texture paint mode and object mode, and it does that automatically. So if I click the first layer, I am automatically put into texture paint mode and I can paint. But when I click the non-painted layer, I am automatically out of texture paint mode. So that's really, really helpful, and it should speed things up a lot. Okay, so what else is new? So another thing that's new is there are some new options in here, which I'm not going to go through in detail. Basically, there's a random option, which basically means if you add 50 duplicates of the same object, it will randomly assign a roughness or whatever else you want to assign, so that's kind of cool. Quite a bit has changed when you're using a texture, so I'll demonstrate that quickly now. So if I just have a texture for the roughness and I import something, and I'll just grab something like this bricks texture, and I have to click refresh again. What you can now do is you can decide which channel you want to select the roughness from. So you can either just use the color of the image, or you can go and use the red channel, you can use the green or the blue, or even the alpha. So this is really handy for some of you who are working with what are called channel packed textures, which basically means you have the red might contain the roughness, the green might contain the metallic, and the blue could contain something else like the emission or something like that. So now you can select which channel you want to use from that image, so really handy to use. While I'm kind of messing around with different channels, this is actually a good time to demonstrate another feature. If you click on these three dots, you get some more options. One of these is you can change the view mode. So material is the default mode, which is kind of just the standard mode in Blender, but you can also click single channel, and as we can see, it shows the channel that you're looking at, and it shows the entire material just through that channel. So for example, we now see the roughness. So if we change back to the color, we can now see the color, which is literally just this constant color. But if I change the opacity, we'll kind of see that underlying color. So this is really handy when you want to kind of fine tune each channel individually, and you don't want to keep looking at just the material. You want to look at the channel itself. So that's a really handy feature as well. But I'm going to swap back to material for now. All right, what are some other things that have been added? So another thing you can do is you can now import layers from other materials. So for example, if I go add layer and I change the layer type to import layers, I can now pick any material inside the blend file. So for example, peeling paint, and I can either import all the layers from that material, in which case it will basically just import everything, or I can import a specific layer from that material. So just the peeling paint layer, if I click OK, and then I jump across to cycles because I set this material up in cycles, and refresh. We now have the peeling paint from that earlier material added on as a layer onto this material. So again, there's so much you can do with that, because you can obviously save all your materials in here, you can import them into Blender, and you can then import layers into other materials. You can mix and match materials. You can pretty much do whatever you want with these new features. Alright, another thing that's changed is there are a bunch of new masks. I'm not going to go through all of them. I'll go through a couple of example ones. So one thing that I've added is you can now select layer mask, and basically you can pick another layer that's inside the current material, and the mask of this current layer will just copy whatever is in the masks of that layer. So for example, if I pick this layer and I preview the masks, it's literally just showing what I painted earlier, because what I painted in this layer now is coming through and acting as a mask in this layer. So that's really good, because whenever you change, so if I click on this layer and I paint something like that, and remembering it won't update unless you're in material preview mode. If I paint some new areas like that, and then I jump across to this layer and view the mask, it just picks up that automatically. So that's really handy if you want to kind of connect multiple layers in a row and connect up all their masks. So again, there's a lot you can do with that. You can also import masks. So this works exactly the same as the import layers. You basically just select the material you're importing from, you select the layer that you're importing from, and then you can import either the entire mask stack, in which case you can copy the color ramps for the stack, or you can import individual masks. So again, this is all just about creating freedom to kind of do more things with the stuff you've got. So I'm not going to do that right now, but you get the point. There's more presets. I'm not going to go through everything. These are going to be in my tutorials when the full version is released, as I mentioned. You can also add a node group now, so you can select whatever node group that you have, and then you can choose the socket that you want to use as a mask. So that's again adding more freedom, because you can create your own node groups and then use them as masks. What else? I think that's all I'll cover for the masking. Let me see. As before, you can import complete materials. So in this case, if you import the peeling paint, you can just import that whole material and it will come in as a single layer, which is opposed to the importing layers method that I looked at before. So when you're importing a material, you can either just copy all the nodes across as a layer, or you can choose to only import the image textures. So basically what that does is it goes through the material you're looking at, it finds image textures, and then it tries to assign them to different channels. So that's going to work very similarly to this multi-texture import button, which you'll probably be familiar with if you've used the add-on before. So one situation when that's really useful is if you're working with something like Extreme PBR or another add-on where you have a library of materials and you just want to pull out the image textures from those materials, you can now import material and go import only image textures, and it will just create a standard layer like this, but it will pull out the image textures from that target material. So that's again really handy, because then you can use things like the box mapping system in PBR Painter or other things. So obviously, again, this is a lot to take in, and as I said, there will be a bunch of tutorial videos released when the full version is released, but for those of you who are familiar with the add-on, please do play around with this new version, because I think there's so much in it that's really handy, and I think you'll have a lot of fun with the new features. Alright, so we're almost done. The next thing I'll briefly talk about is there is now new options for the ID map. So I'm not going to go into detail what the ID map is. If you know what it is, then you'll find this handy. Basically, you can now, if I click refresh, you can now choose between either an image texture, which you could previously, or you can use vertex color. So basically you can use vertex colors for the object to create your ID map, or you can create your own. So for example, if I click create new, what it will do is it will swap me into vertex paint mode, and then I can kind of paint over different faces like that, or I can even go into edit mode and select a bunch of faces and go fill with that color. So something like that. And now I can grab that color with my ID color, and that will basically mask this current layer with only those vertices. So if I turn that off, I need to delete this mask, so I had that previous mask in there. What we can see is it's now masked the current layer with that ID map, where it's just kind of picking out the vertices that are included. And obviously I can go back into here and I can click this little eye button, and that will let me paint new areas, or I can select faces and add new colors. And then when I turn that off, my material gets assigned to just those faces. So really, really handy. Another thing that's been changed with the ID map, you can now use multiple ID colors for one layer. So if you have an ID map with lots and lots of different colors and you want your layer to cover maybe 3 or 4 of those colors, you can just add in heaps of colors and then pick out all of the colors that you want, not just the single color. So again, really handy. All right, so that's it for the ID maps. Now, one more thing I'll look at very quickly is the new baking system. So in the baking tab, there is a bunch of new stuff. And again, I'm not going to go into it with a lot of detail. A lot of this is similar to the previous version, so you can save things externally and all of these things. You can now bake ambient occlusion along with your other channels. You can now tick this button to create exportable material. And basically what that means is it's going to make a material on your model that has everything set up, ready to be exported as something like .fbx. So that's really handy if you want to use your material that you've made in PBR Painter for something outside of Blender, such as some sort of game engine or something similar. You can now automatically bake your material into something that can be exported. So really handy as well. So I definitely encourage you to play around with that. There's a new type of channel selection. So previously there was automatic and manual. If you select manual, you can now use something called channel packing, and this is quite complicated. So again, there'll be a tutorial on this once the full version is released. But just briefly, basically what channel packing lets you do is it lets you bake your channels to individual channels in an image. So for example, as I mentioned earlier, you may want to bake roughness to the red color of an image. You may bake metallic to the green color of an image, and so forth. So the way that that works in this new system is you basically add these channel packed images, and these are basically your configurations for how you want the baking to work. So for example, you may choose in the color channel of this image, you may choose to bake the base color, And in the alpha channel, you may choose to bake the ambient occlusion. And then you can then use those channels in a different program or something like that. And then that image will come out with the color as the color, and it will have the ambient occlusion baked into the alpha of that image. Also, if you want, so you can just add as many of these as you want, and it will just literally bake these exactly as you specify in here. The other cool thing you can do is you can click this pack individual RGB channels, and then you can actually choose one channel for each of these red, green, and blue channels. So for example, you can choose to bake the metallic in the red, you can choose to bake the roughness in the green, and you may choose to bake something like specular or whatever else. Alpha, metallic, ambient occlusion in the blue, and then you may choose something else to bake into the alpha. Once you're happy with your configuration, so for example, if you're always exporting your material to the same external program, you can save this as your default. And then next time when you're playing around with things, you can just load the default settings and then you can just bake it as you've got it set up here. So again, there's way too much to kind of explain in this one video with this. And this is kind of a fairly advanced feature, but if this is applicable to you, I definitely encourage you to try it out and let me know what you think. And there'll be, as I said, a much more in-depth tutorial once the final version is released. And I think that's most of the changes. There are lots and lots of other little things, but too much to go through in this video. So I think I will leave the video there. And just to finish off, I'll just show you how easy it is once you've kind of got a material set up. For example, this rusty metal, how easy it is just to kind of drag on that material and then you can kind of have it set up for your model ready to go. So the idea of this is you can just build up a complete library of your own handmade materials and then use them in your projects whenever you want. And combine them, as I showed with the importing layers and everything like that. By the way, 2 of the early tutorials for the next version will be how to make these materials, which is a really good way to understand how to use the new systems in the new version. And with that being said, I think I'll leave it. I know there are a lot of new features and it probably is overwhelming even for those of you who have used the add-on a lot before, but I do encourage you to have a go. As I said at the start of the video, make sure you do it on a non-production file, because if there are any bugs or anything like that, you don't want to mess up your main files. And please do report any bugs that you find in the Discord server, or send me an email, or leave it as a comment in this video. Otherwise, thanks for watching and I hope you enjoy the new version. Cheers.